Walking around the Vatican is an exercise in paradox. Have you ever been to the Vatican? I was lucky enough to go there. I visited quite a while ago now, but I remember it, and I'd love to go back soon. I remember, I remember being struck by so many things that were almost confusing to me. I mean, first, it's a city within a city and an independent country within another country. It's ancient and deeply historic and filled with modern people taking modern pictures with their modern phones. The buildings are massive and architecturally powerful, but then I always think about how small the Pope looks when he comes out on his little balcony to wave to the people. Some of the world's greatest works of art are there. There is gold inlaid throughout the cathedrals and ceilings, while so many Catholics around the world are working class or poor. It's beautiful and complicated, stunning and slightly disorienting. It was a paradox come to life. Some folks I know are not comfortable with paradox. Some folks are far more interested in black and white answers and clear rights and wrongs. Part of why I absolutely loved recording this episode of the Between podcast is because of how comfortable our conversation was right in the middle of the messy paradox. I'm really glad you're here. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the Between podcast. This is your host, Matt Mattson, and I'm delighted that I get to introduce our guest today, who I hope will help me build another sacred conversation inside this little podcast world we've built. Paul Fahey is the creator of an online newsletter, podcast, social media presence, and overall digital platform called Pope Francis Generation. That's how we initially interacted on social media through that handle, the Pope Francis Generation handle. And I was really fascinated by the work he was doing there. It's love-filled. It's super smart, sometimes a little too smart for me. Paul often posts on faith-related stuff that I've never even heard of. And I kind of really like that. I love being challenged like that. I Google a lot of the stuff that he actually posts. Uh, Paul is a lay catechist, a counseling student, and a writer. He lives in Michigan with his, how many kids do you have, Paul? 4 or 5?
5 kids.
5 kids. It's a lot of kids. And his wife, Christina, who is herself an artist who creates these wonderful Catholic themed pieces. I was actually just on her Etsy store, and man, just cool stuff. Paul, I'm really excited to have you here today. Can we start off with the job of catechist? For folks like me who exist kind of on the outskirts of the Catholic tradition, what the heck is a catechist?
Yeah. So, first of all, it's great to be here. And my wife, Christina, is definitely the talented one in the family. Yeah, what is a catechist? There's probably a few different directions I could go, but at its heart, it's someone within the Catholic faith who is tasked with, either with children or adults, echoing down. That's what the word means. Catechesis means to echo down. To echo down. Now, if you're echoing, you're not echoing your own message, you're echoing someone else's. So that is the most primarily the teaching of the church. But at its heart, what being a catechist means is sharing a message that isn't your own, that's the church's. But the heart of that message is the kerygma, which is a Greek word that means both the proclamation of the good news and the good news itself. So at its heart, catechesis is sharing most fundamentally the goodness of God and his desire for us, made manifest most explicitly in Jesus Christ, and God's desire to save us and heal us. Everything else the church teaches revolves around that. And that's the role of the catechist, is to share that message most fundamentally.
Echoing down the kerygma. By the way, I Googled kerygma this morning. Just this morning, I Googled kerygma because I was on your website and thought, you know what? I should probably know what that word means. And sure enough, it comes up right at the beginning, an echoing down of the good news. So, like in practice, is it like a teacher? Is it, is it like somebody who I mean, tell me
Yeah.
what does it look like? What is the job of it?
Yeah. So it could look like a number of different things. I mean, it's a universal church. It's going to look different in, you know, Asia than it's going to look in Michigan.
Mhm.
Uh, the role that I had, so I worked at a Catholic parish for almost 8 years as the director of religious education. That was my title. And I did catecheses, so I taught classes for grade school students. I taught classes for high school students. I helped them prepare for different sacraments, for First Communion or for confirmation. I also taught classes for adults. The class at the time was called RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. Now it's called the OCIA, because Catholics got to have names for everything.
Yeah.
Um, but that was a class for adults who were wanting to become Catholic, who were either not baptized or were coming from different Christian denominations wanting to join the church. I taught that class as well. So kids, adults, that was the role that I had for a long time. I also did formation for other catechists, most primarily leading retreats, and I still do that.
It's I read like a critique of Protestant church in somebody's social media post recently, and the critique was basically like, there's a lot of churches that you can and go to forever and feel good when you go on Sunday, but they don't lead you anywhere. That was the critique. Not necessarily one that I agreed with or did disagreed with. It struck me because I actually love the idea of I hope my faith keeps growing. I hope my faith goes somewhere. I hope I get deeper and deeper and deeper into whatever it is that I'm seeking. And so I'm interested in sort of I think the Catholic world has done a good job of putting names on everything and building lots of probably bureaucracy and curricula and many other layers. But for a purpose to lead you someplace, right? Like to keep guiding you deeper and deeper into your faith. Am I on the right path there?
Yes, yeah. And if you look at like a Catholic understanding of salvation, there's kind of two parts to it. So one is, which I think is shared pretty universally amongst Christians, and that is we are saved from our sins.
Mhm.
Like Christ saves us from our sins. But a Catholic and Orthodox, and probably other denominations as well, have a further understanding that Christ saves us from our sins to save us for something greater.
Hmm.
And that something greater in Catholic theology is explicitly a share in God's own life. St. Athanasius, one of the early church fathers, said that God became man so that man might become God.
Hmm.
And uh, Pope Francis, in his teaching, really articulates that this is a lifelong process. So there's always growing. So I am both. I both have been divinized through especially baptism in Catholic theology, but then I am still being divinized, being made divine by God, um, my mind and my heart and my whole body throughout the course of my life. So
Hmm.
there's always growth. There's always healing and there's always growth and there's always more. And that's something that I love about the Catholic faith, that like it's always challenging because there's always more work that the Lord needs to do with me and for me, right? So yeah, our understanding of salvation as being an ever-growing process certainly reflects in all of our teachings and things like that.
Yeah. So you brought up Pope Francis. Obviously, you write a newsletter and run a social media platform called Pope Francis Generation. My sense is that you're an aficionado, if not a devotee, or at the very least a big fan. Could you teach the novice like me? I mean, I'm a fan of Pope Francis based on everything I see in the headlines and in the Vatican's and the Pope's own social media presence is solid. Like if I'm a follower of the Pope, I am at the very least on social media a follower of the Pope. I read a lot of what's put out there, and Pope Francis just seems special and new and fresh to an outsider like me, who just sort of has watched the Catholic faith from maybe a third party presence. Will you teach me about what I guess Pope Francis is all about and why I think you would agree he's such a unique pope for this generation, for this moment? What is it about Pope Francis that inspired you? Would you just talk a little bit about Pope Francis and how he fits in our world right now?
Yeah. Um, it's interesting that you share that at least the connections that you have within Catholicism, you feel like you follow Pope Francis in some
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
Um, you're not the first non-Catholic to share that with me. For a couple of years, a long time ago, I worked at Calvin College in West Michigan, and I worked in the bookstore, and there are many students who worked there. And the year, I think it was March, that Pope Francis was elected, some of the students who worked at the bookstore were on a like study abroad that semester.
Mm.
So that summer when they came back, they had visited Rome at the time that he was elected. I mean, these are diehard Reformed Protestants. Like these are Dutch Reformed Protestants who
At
they're like
Calvin College. This is
at
not
Calvin
yeah.
College. Yeah. Yeah. Man, I think I remember her saying, yeah, all four of my grandparents are Dutch. Like this is as Dutch reform as you can get. And after her experience of Pope Francis being elected, she's like, he's my Pope too.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, there's something about that. For me personally, my first real, I think, encounter with Pope Francis's teaching was a couple years after he became Pope. He announced the Year of Mercy, and there was a book published with it that an interview with him called "The Name of God is Mercy," and I read that book at that time, and I left that book saying to myself, "I want to believe in the God that Pope Francis believes in."
Mm.
Now, at that point, I'd been Catholic for 25, 30 years, my
Yeah.
entire life, and I recognized that the God I believed in was different than the God that the Pope believed in. And what the Pope was presenting was something much more compelling. And I think that the thing that Pope Francis brings to the church, not that other popes didn't bring that, but the way that he emphasizes it is important. I think he has a specific concern for prioritizing belonging. So there's different veins within the church, different thoughts within the church. There's other thoughts that would say, people have to have the right belief or the right behavior in order to belong.
Mhm.
I think Francis prioritizes belonging, and by that I mean welcome people, accommodate them as much as we can without compromising what's essential to us, because it's in the safety and security of belonging that the Lord is most like we are most open to the Lord bringing us into right belief and right behavior. Belonging comes first, and if we prioritize that, what does that look like? And for me, it was he's as anti-fundamentalist as you can get.
Mhm.
Like he's anti-clericalist, anti-rigid thinking. Where I grew up in like, you know, culture war Christianity that saw the other as the enemy that needed to be defeated in some way. Francis was proposing, no, there's no enemies. Like he said, the church is a field hospital. Like we don't have enemies in the battlefield. Everyone in the battlefield is someone who needs healing, and it's our job to go and provide them healing. Um, so this anti-fundamentalism, this Christianity that prioritized belonging, um, that is what really attracted me to Pope Francis to begin with. And I think that emphasis that he brings is perhaps what I think is most important, his most important contribution to the church.
This that simple concept that the church is not a warrior on the battlefield. The church is the field hospital in the middle of it. That is I mean, for a lot of listeners who are in the midst of, an election year, in the midst of major culture wars being played out in pulpits of all faith traditions, but especially across American Christianity, man, that metaphor in itself can be a really challenging one, I think, can it? That we're not supposed to we're not supposed to be fighting on the battlefield. We're supposed to be the field hospital.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many levels of challenging. Like I think at the heart of a fundamentalist is a rigid thinking, an idea that I possess the truth and therefore other people don't, but also a fear of the outsider, a fear of the outside world. I must protect myself from them in some way. They are the enemy. So I was very much involved in like conservative culture, like culture war Christianity for a long time, and saw like the secular world as the enemy that needed to be beaten and that I needed to protect myself and my family from in some way. Okay, so I feel like Pope Francis in the past several years has helped, been a catalyst for the Lord freeing me from that. But even now, I'm still like, so now I'm more critical of like veins of traditionalism within the Catholic Church than I was, 10 years ago. But I still find myself having fundamentalist attitudes towards traditionalists, where I feel like, well, they're the enemy. They don't belong. And like, there's still this call to like, no, they need grace and healing as much as anyone else does. Um, so yeah, it's a very challenging framework because it forces me to be like, okay, whenever I feel protective or fearful or antagonistic towards another person or another group, that's a call for me to do a self-examination, not a call for me to double down and keep waging whatever this war is.
I know this is not a new or novel thought, but that fear, and the walls we build up in response to our own fear are those are the walls that cause all of us our own problems, right? I mean, the amount of times I reflect on, am I leading out of fear or out of love? Am I acting out of fear or out of love? Am I responding to somebody who I'm in significant conflict with out of fear or out of love? That is such a simple idea. It goes back, probably well before Christianity. In fact, I'm pretty certain of it, that those two things are the daily challenge that we all have to live with in their most simple terms. But to watch uh, the way you describe Pope Francis and the way that I've seen Pope Francis show up within the world, not just within the church, not just within the Catholic Church, but the way he's shown up for the world and said, we're not going to fear first. We're going to love first. We're going to offer belonging first. And there are things, obviously, I think it's okay to say there are things that I don't agree with every political, stance that the Pope has had to make. Uh, I think recently he both made significant progress in my mind on affirming same-sex unions, a significant incremental progress within an old traditional church. And so for me, Matt Mattson personally, like thumbs up on that. That's cool. And then just came out with, there's big news about this week. This episode won't come out for a while, but the big news this week is about surrogacy, right? Like his stance on surrogacy, which seems a little like I don't get that point of view. And still, uh, he continues to show up and lead with not just stylistically, but putting a heart first, leading, showing an example to the world of what it means to lead with love, what it means to lead with belonging first. I love that you categorized it that way. That stuff is just really inspiring to watch.
Yeah, I think that what Francis does is he recognizes that uh, within Catholicism, there are things you can't compromise with. Like we believe that there's doctrines that the Lord has revealed to us. So
Yeah.
like the nature of marriage, the dignity of the human person, the purpose of sexuality, all
Mhm.
of all of these different things that we can't compromise on because we believe they're good and they come from the Lord. But I think Francis's disposition is okay. So we can either build up all these uh, if there's like a big red line, we can build up all these walls to protect that line as much as we can, or we can recognize what's essential and what's not and accommodate as much as we can without compromising what's essential. Um, and I think that's Francis's disposition. He holds the line of what we believe is good and true as Catholics, but accommodates, I think, more than what a lot of people are comfortable with
Yeah.
in order to help people feel like they belong.
Yeah. So I want to get a little nerdy with you, but I'll ask you to be, gentle with me because I know not what I'm talking about, to be honest. But I found on the internet you did a presentation not long ago, and maybe had written some stuff on a concept that Pope Francis wrote about called Fratelli Tutti. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. That's Latin for I don't know what, but because I don't speak any Latin at all, but I think it's something about like the brotherhood of man, or the fratelli word looks pretty familiar to me. Anyway, I've glanced at a couple articles about this message for Tutti from Pope Francis, and I can't help but think that if I had someone explain it to me in layman's terms, I think it might directly relate to the work we're trying to do here at Between. Can you talk about that concept for Tutti and why Pope Francis has emphasized that idea?
Yeah. Yeah. So just a little bit of background. So there's a whole bunch of there's many different kinds of teaching documents in the church. And some are for different groups, some have different levels of authority, etc. But one of the highest is it's a papal document, a document from the Pope called an encyclical. So it's a letter for the church.
Hmm.
So back in 2020, in October of 2020, um, in the midst of uh, a world that was in quite a bit of chaos in 2020, the Pope released a document, an encyclical titled Fratelli Tutti. Now most encyclicals are in Latin, and this one's actually in Italian.
Hmm.
And it's a quote from Pope Francis's patron, Saint Francis of Assisi, in an address that he gave Francis gave his community. And that phrase means brothers all, or I think the English title of the encyclical is Brothers and Sisters All. And I think absolutely it relates to the work that you're doing here is what Francis is emphasizing. Now, again, this has been in the church's teaching for ever. I mean, it's coming, I mean, St. Francis of Assisi lived in like the 1200s, right?
Right.
But what Pope Francis is emphasizing is this sense of universal fraternity, that every single human person, every single human being is a child of God the Father. And if that's the case, then therefore, every single human person has infinite dignity.
Hmm.
And like we could pause there. We spent hours talking, unpacking what that means. Like that is profound and challenging. And then he goes further and says, not only does every single person have infinite dignity, if we are all children of God the Father, then we are all brothers and sisters, and therefore have this interdependence, this responsibility towards everyone else. And he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan from Scripture, where the Pharisee asks Jesus, "Who's my neighbor?" And Jesus tells the parable, and then asks the guy, "So who is this person's neighbor?" And I said, "The guy who helped him." And Jesus is like, "Go and do likewise." Right? This sense of fraternal responsibility towards the whole world, and that we have a moral responsibility to not just see the Lord, see Jesus in the face of the most vulnerable people we encounter, which we do have that moral responsibility. But Francis goes further and says we also have the moral responsibility to work to tear down unjust structures within our communities and our society that disadvantage those who are most vulnerable. We must work for greater structural justice. So this is all packed into this idea that we are all brothers and sisters. Um, and I mean, I found that I've read through that document several times, but especially in 2020 in the United States, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of, a month before the most contentious presidential election that we've had up to that point, um, that teaching being a really profound source of consolation for me, and since then.
Yeah. That, yeah, again, not a new concept that everyone, we're all brothers, but to emphasize it, to circle it, to point to it, and to say this is the thing that the world needs to remember about itself right now. In the middle of 2020, and we're not too far removed from that, when everyone was looking at everyone fearfully. I mean, literally walking through the grocery store, we were afraid of each other. And that that fear of each other because of a potential virus started to turn into, it started to leak into our brains and leak into our souls in the way that we just saw each other. And that manifested in so many different ways, obviously politically, but in so many other little micro ways that we are still absolutely dealing with the pain of. And to say, no, brothers and sisters all, that we all must see the face of Jesus in the face of every passerby, no matter how much we might be afraid of them at the time. What a message, and what a universal and long lasting message, but what a message for that particular moment. I'm curious if I mean, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast, Paul. But you were my second choice for this particular episode. My first choice was Pope Francis. He was unavailable. If I was, uh, I'll ask you to do what I'm sure you're perfectly comfortable doing, and that is to speak directly for the Pope. Okay, so if I, if I was in your mind, if I was interviewing the Pope about his view on what we're all about here at Between, this idea of sacred human connection. And sometimes I'll be honest, I know that I toe maybe a heretical line because I talk about the sacrament of human connection, and I know that's a little outside of traditional teaching, but I'm I'm I've become deeply passionate that about the idea that we as humans need to start seeing these conversations like you and I are having right now as sacred as anything else we do, or at least we can treat them that way. And if we do, I think it changes a whole lot. Um, anyway, I'm curious what the Pope would say if I asked him, can a moment of human connection be sacred? What would he think?
So before I presume to speak on behalf of the Pope, I don't think that statement that encounters with other people and connections with other people is sacramental. I mean, in Catholic theology, we have like seven sacraments and there's specific things and all this kind of stuff. But a sacrament, in a broad sense, from a Catholic point of view, is something that both symbolizes and makes present something of God. And if we believe human beings are made in the image and likeness of God and are children of God the Father and have infinite dignity, and Christ himself in the Gospel of Matthew, when he talks about the final judgment and separating the sheep from the goats, and what's the criteria that he separates the sheep from the goats? When I was hungry, did you give me food? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? Uh, God himself identified himself with the most vulnerable and marginalized in the human family, not in an abstract way, in a concrete way, where if I go and visit someone in prison, I'm visiting Jesus. There's something sacramental about that,
Yeah.
at its very core. Um, okay, so then to go back to the question, to speak on behalf of Pope Francis, I think yes. I mean, this isn't Pope Francis. I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but it was something about how, um, uh, like if we understood the true dignity and reality of the people around us, we would just be on our face in worship of the people around us, right?
Yeah.
Um, but here's what Francis says. So I'm going to read a paragraph from Fratelli Tutti that I think answers this question. So Francis is talking about human persons, and he's talking about how we really only thrive when we are connected with others. So he says this is from paragraph 87 for folks following along at home. He says, human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. Nor can they fully know themselves apart from an encounter with other persons. I communicate effectively with myself only insofar as I communicate with others. No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. Life exists where there is bonding, communion, fraternity, and life is stronger than death when it is built on true relationships and bonds of fidelity. On the contrary, there is no life when we claim to be self-sufficient and live as islands. In these attitudes, death prevails. So I think absolutely Francis would say that it's within human connection, not only that we encounter God, yes, but that also that's the only place that we actually live and thrive.
There was a line that you just read. I'm going to mess it up because I didn't quite get it all down, but life is stronger than death when we are connected with others.
Yes.
A we are. I'm gonna grow from that. Life is stronger than death when we are connected with others. We can be. There is a resurrection in connection. There is that it is available to us. That is Christ, right? I mean, that is the promise of Christ, and it is accessible right there in our interactions with each other, in the way that we can be with each other. Thought you did a great job at answering for the Pope by just reading what the Pope wrote. Uh, you're man. I could live there for a long time. In fact, you said we could pause and talk about infinite dignity for a long time. And actually, if you don't mind, I'd actually like to go into that for a second because that is a challenging concept. The
Yeah.
that everybody has infinite dignity. Let me not add too many words here. Let me just ask you, what do you think that means? And really, everybody?
Yeah. So, um, I was a theology and history major in undergrad, so I took math for the liberal arts, right? Um, so one of the very few parts of math that I understand, because in that class we talked about infinity. And I was actually just talking about this with my oldest, who's in fifth grade, just a couple of months ago at dinner. We're talking about infinity. I'm like, okay. I'm thinking about all the numbers, the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, go on for infinity. And I asked my son, I'm like, how big is that number? I'm like, does that number end? He's like, no, you can always add one more. I'm like, okay. I'm like, now let's count by fives, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, etc. I'm like, how big is that set of numbers? He's like, well, it goes on for infinity. You can always add five more. I'm like, exactly. I'm like, now which set has more numbers in it? The ones counting by ones, the ones counting by fives. And he chose the obvious answer, which is the ones counting by ones. But the correct answer is that they're both the same size. There's something about infinity that is mysterious and challenging. By saying that every single human being has infinite dignity, we're saying that one person is not less valuable than 5 people or 10 people or 50 people, because every single person has infinite value. And by saying every single human person, we're saying that, and in that same document, Fratelli Tutti, the Pope really hones in on this, and he talks about the church's teaching on capital punishment, which he himself, just a couple of years previous, had developed the church's teaching to condemn capital punishment all the way around. And he says, there's nothing that we can do to diminish our own dignity because it's given to us by God and it's infinite. And he said, if a society can love the greatest of sinners, the greatest of criminals in its community, it can love and respect anybody.
Mm.
Like the life of the murderer is no less infinitely dignified than the life of the most innocent child. This is what Francis is saying. So what the church is saying when we talk about every single human person's infinite dignity. So on its face, it's really compelling. You're like, yes, that's the kind of thing I want to believe. But then when you just even take half a step back, you're like, wow, that's incredibly challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in a book that came out in 2020, kind of as a companion, it's an interview, kind of as a companion to Fratelli Tutti. It's called Let Us Dream. Pope Francis talked about the culture in the world as not respecting human dignity. And he said, and I'm going to get the quote almost right. He's like, we despise the imposition that other people's value put on us, which means that the opposite is the Christian perspective, which is that we must welcome the imposition that other people's value and dignity puts on us. But how many times throughout my day, if I'm actually honest with myself, do I despise in small ways, but not in significant ways, the imposition that other people put on me just because they exist and are in my space? Um, but the Christian attitude, the way that the Lord wants to continue to heal me and transform me is that no, I welcome those impositions because that person is infinitely valuable and made in the image and likeness of God.
Cool. That last little bit is emotionally striking to me for a completely benign reason. Like the idea that micro annoyances, like little like people are just in my space. People cut me off on the road. People are mildly rude to me at the grocery store. Uh, the fact that like that is that is me choosing to not to close my eyes and close my heart and close my soul to their infinite value and to attach entirely to my own selfish needs. That is even those little micro annoyances. And I say that that strikes me emotionally because A, it happens all the time. And B, I kind of feel like sometimes I feel like with the work that I'm trying to do with Between, it's about that. It's always about that for me because it's a bit, whether I admit it or not, so much of this work that I'm trying to do for the world is really me trying to do this work for me, right? Like trying to work myself through the way I am at the line at the in line at the grocery store and the way I am when somebody cuts me off in traffic and to man be faced with this question of can I not just recognize but honor and to call back to something you said earlier, worship the infinite dignity of the person that I'm encountering right now and to see them fully as God, as man, that's heavy in a weird way because it's not
Yeah,
about it. It's about the little normal crap that is all in all of our day, right?
it's heavy, but I also find it incredibly real. So something else in the church's teaching here about fraternity is we aren't self-sufficient, as the Pope said. In Catholic theology, the fundamental building block of society isn't the individual, it's the family. And if you think about that, before we hit record, you were talking about your kids and having to now go to your kids' sporting events and
Yeah.
things like that. Uh, my experience of being a parent is a constant purging of my own needs and wants because of the imposition that they put on me just by existing in my home. Like, I went from, as a single person or even as a married person before we had kids, being able to like get home from work and be like, you know what? I'm gonna go to a movie tonight. I'm gonna go
Yeah.
to a movie tonight. To like after having just one child, sleep isn't even my own. I can't even decide when I sleep anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, um, but so our youngest, he's just over a year old. So his birth is closest in my memory. Like, but I experienced this when all of my kids were born. Like, when I held him for the first time, it was like my heart grew.
Mm.
It was like my capacity to love, which I thought was maxed
Mhm.
out. That capacity grows. So their imposition, like, is welcomed. Like I welcomed the imposition that this infant, and there's maybe nothing more imposing than a newborn infant. I I wouldn't want anything else, right? So like family is this, if it's embraced, I have experienced it to be this school of
Mm.
welcoming the imposition of the other. And um, the Lord has healed and uh, transformed me within my family to a way that I interact with people outside my family very differently now than when I did 12 years ago when I got married.
I will try to remember that this evening as I'm waiting in the car, tapping my foot, uh, scowling, grumbling under my breath. We're going to be late. Could you all just hurry up and get out of the house? I will try to remember that this evening, Paul, in those moments. You're right, though. I mean, that's it. And, uh, and man, when we welcome a kid into our world, uh, our capacity to love grows is such a true thing that is obvious to everybody who's felt it, and is so it is also one of those mysteries that make you believe that there has to be something more out there. There has to be some mystery out there because nothing can explain this feeling of holding my child for the first time. Man, you're a counselor, a counselor in training. You're studying
Mhm.
counseling right now. I'm actually really interested to. talk to you from that perspective too, especially when it comes to the way that we as humans connect with each other. What does your counseling lens teach you? I'll stop making you speak for Pope Francis. You can just talk for you now, Paul. But what does your counseling lens teach you about the importance of authentic human connection, and maybe even why so many people struggle with it?
Yeah, I found it all to be like my faith and then my counseling formation all to be very congruent. So, yeah, so I graduate this spring uh and then I will be a counselor.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Um, the the program that I've been going through for counseling education is has a person-centered orientation. So
Mhm.
that comes from the thought and teaching of Carl Rogers from the mid 20th century, and he believed, and I believe, he believed that uh, people best grow and heal and thrive when they're in an environment where they know that they are understood, where they are being treated with empathy, where there's genuineness, and where there's non-judgment, what Rogers called unconditional positive regard. That is the environment in which people grow. And when I learned that going through my education, I'm like, yes, absolutely. And that's what my faith teaches me too, right? And that's the connection with Pope Francis too. Like it's in the safety of belonging.
Mhm.
It's in the safety of knowing most fundamentally that I'm loved and wanted unconditionally by God. It's in that place that I'm able to self-reflect. It's in that place that I'm able to change my beliefs, that I'm able to experience conversion and repentance. It's in that place that I'm able to grow and heal. Um, so all of that has been very, very congruent. So like my role and goal and purpose as a counselor, I see it as very, very similar to the the role that I had as a minister. And that is that when I'm with someone, that it's as if Christ is with me and that they have my undivided attention and that I need to let them know that I care about them, that I'm hearing what they're saying, that I'm feeling what they're feeling, and that no matter what they share, like they have my unconditional respect as a human being,
Mm.
as a son or daughter of God who's with infinite dignity, right? Um, so yeah, all of my experience in counseling education has been very congruent. It's been very formative, very positively formative, but has just helped like unpack more and more layers of my own faith and my own experience.
Well, it's Roger's simple idea that if we don't have these, if we don't have connection, trust, belonging, unconditional positive regard, if we, or even if we don't have enough of that, we will start to experience disarray in our life, in our mental life, in our emotional life, and likely that manifests into our real life and shows up in real ways in our work or in our school or anyway. To think about the increase of mental health challenges that young people are experiencing today, and to compare that to, not necessarily with causation, but to compare it to the significant decrease in levels of intimate friendships and relationships and uh, meaningful connection with parents inside the home because of device interruption, because of all sorts of other things that are in the. I'm not going to. I don't have the science to build that obvious cause, but to me, it looks pretty clearly connected that we're living in this really disconnected world, and people are hurting more and more. And I've also this that comment also has me thinking about. I've had an opportunity uh, to there's a spot in Denver that I go to sometimes, and I've been able to interact with lately a lot more people who are experiencing homelessness, and I've just had lots more cool conversations with currently unhoused people. And so often I'm struck by how they can be kind to me. I literally will leave the conversation thinking you don't have a place to live right now. You're struggling to find food. You don't have any place warm to go. You clearly don't have a lot of people around you that you're connected with on a daily basis, that you're talking to on a daily basis. Without all those things, how can you possibly be this kind to me in this moment? Because I'm aware of how damaging a lack of those things can be for people. Anyway, I've been thinking, I've been trying to put that together, trying to make it make sense, and the only way I can make it make sense is maybe to consider the infinite dignity of the person that I'm talking to and how somehow, these people are truly showing up for me. I'm not showing up for them. They're showing up for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that and I think this is a essential shift within Christianity is like our sense of charity or of caring for others, especially the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. We are not doing them a favor. We are through them encountering Christ,
Yeah.
right? And they are like uh the folks you are visiting. They are through you encountering Christ.
Mm.
Um, that it is this mutual and reciprocal and like co-responsible thing, not me coming in, having it all together, like trying to fix somebody.
Yeah.
That's not the dynamic that's going
No,
on here.
that's right. One more topic I wanted to get to. Our time is running short because this has been a great conversation. But this topic is not an easy one to talk about, but I know one that you're willing to dive into. Systemic abuse. Uh, Systemic abuse has been and is a reality within many branches of faith, many branches of Christianity, including obviously Catholicism. But I sense that you still believe in the Catholic Church. Um, Me too. I believe in religious institutions, even though they have proven problematic in many ways. I know they are problematic in many ways. Uh, and that can be really hard to do, to name these big, real problems that have caused very real trauma and very real harm in very real people's lives and still do, and still believe in the institution itself, to believe in the idea of the church, to hold that tension. How can we do that? How can we hold good and bad at the same time? From a Catholic perspective, I think it's helpful to have that conversation.
Yeah. How can we do that? Man, I wish I had the answer. All I know is that I believe I need to do that
Mm.
because everything else, anything less than that feels untrue, right? It's like it's like the problem of suffering. I read a book a year or two ago by Brad Jersak about suffering and deconstruction, and it's a phenomenal book. He talks about the problem of suffering, and he's like, both things are true. It is both true that the suffering in the world, the suffering that I've experienced, is real and is horrible. And it is also true that God is good.
Mm.
Now, it often feels like those things contradict each other. Not just feels like, by all appearances, they do, but somehow both are true. And he says that holding both of those things is a paradox. And he's like, so the cross then is the center of that paradox,
Mm.
where God himself is dying and he cries out to God and says, why have you abandoned me?
Mm.
It's like nothing about this makes sense. All of this is paradox. But all we know is that Christ, that God himself is with us in that paradox, is in that holding of the tension. So here I am as a Catholic, and I'm like, all of the abuse that I have seen in the church, that I've heard firsthand from people in the church, that I've experienced myself in some ways in the church, that is true. And also, it is true that I believe the church is the body of Christ that has been sent and empowered by God to bring about his kingdom in the world, to make the world a better place. I believe both of those things are true. Now, they often feel very contradictory, but letting go of one or the other feels like a betrayal of what's true.
Mm.
Um, and even in Francis himself, I think earlier you said, um, I'm a devotee of Francis, and maybe I was. Um, I I don't think I am anymore. I think my experience of uh, my experience of Catholicism over the past several years, and certainly not just mine, has been one spiritual leader after another spiritual leader, like just like dominoes falling. As like
Hmm.
look at the hidden lives. I think especially of like Jean Vanier, and he's worth looking up. He founded the L'Arche community that was integrating and doing incredible ministry with folks with disabilities. And after he died, it came out that he was a systemic abuser,
Mm.
right? Of vulnerable people. That being a devotee of anyone, uh, I would say is not safe.
Mm.
That is not safe for me. But at the same, so with Francis, I have here is someone who teaches something that I believe is true and good and beautiful, and that is anti-fundamentalist, is makes the church a safer place, respects, helps the church respect human dignity more. And also, as a person, he fails to live up to his own teaching. And both of those things are true. And to let go of one feels dishonest.
Yeah.
Hanging on to both of them is also a struggle and not easy in any way at all. But living in that tension, for me, has been the only place that feels true.
Mm. Man, I feel like there is a direct application to real relationships in everybody's real life that reflect that paradox, that reflect that tension, and that a lot of us have a hard time just reconciling because we we know we know one thing to be true and beautiful about a person in our life, and we know other things that are not. And it is really hard to just live there in the middle of those things, and for both of them to be true, and for us to not be able to do anything about it except to be with people. Um,
And
man,
and to resist the temptation to make it easy, to let
yeah,
go of the tension, to simplify it. Like if it's the truth that sets us free, then like oh, we got to hang on to all the truth, even the uncomfortable parts.
yeah. Hey, what are you hopeful for right now? For you call this, or you call the work that you're doing, the Pope Francis generation. Um, so if you and I are maybe if I'm on the older end of the Pope Francis generation, and you're younger and in the middle of it, and there are young people today, I think our kids are your kids are probably a little young and are probably getting a little bit of what the experiences of learning from somebody like Pope Francis in this moment are. My kids are a little older and they're a little tuned in, and I start to really think like these are the leaders of the world today are people that they will tell stories about to their grandchildren. They'll say, well, this is what I saw in a leader, and this is what I saw in an example, and this is what I saw in the way our culture was shifting. So what are you hopeful for today for young people who are coming up in the Pope Francis generation?
Yeah. There's a couple of things that come to mind. The first thing is that I'm not sure I'm particularly optimistic.
Hmm.
But I feel like if God is good, and I believe he is, then I have to be hopeful.
Hmm.
Um, within the church, I'm hopeful for uh, continued reform to happen to make the church less fundamentalist
Hmm.
and safer for people. Um, I'm hopeful for people in my generation and younger who, I mean, I was 12 years old when the Boston Globe story about clerical abuse in the church first hit. Like my whole experience of Catholicism has been under that shadow.
Yeah.
Um, and that like that's not a small thing. Like I do not experience being Catholic in a triumphalistic way at
Hmm.
all. Because how do you look around at that reality and feel triumphalistic about it? And I have a heart for making things better, even if it's just within my circles of influence, within my communities, make things safer for people who are most vulnerable and most marginalized. I know I'm not the only one. So I feel like this generation and younger who have only known a church of abusive power and scandal is maybe more motivated, I hope, right? Not optimistic, but hopeful that that will encourage more reform and more change in the church to make it more a place of healing than harm. Um, yeah, so my hope ultimately rests in the work that the Holy Spirit's doing and the people of God. That's the direction I hope that it goes in.
Well, I'm pretty sure when this episode comes out, it's going to be titled, "Unfortunately, the Pope was not available." And I thought you did a great job of, sitting in and holding the weight of, the big Pope hat. So I appreciate that. I have loved this conversation, Paul. This, as we predicted, we, stayed mostly on script and in what we kind of prepared for. And then there were some surprises along the way. There were some cool little moments of new thoughts that I did not see coming, man. I loved this conversation. Thanks for diving into this sacred space with me. And will you tell people what's a good way to connect with you and to learn about Pope Francis Generation and all the good work that you're doing?
Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation a lot, Matt. I stay primarily in Catholic bubbles because those are just the circles that I run in, and it's fantastic to be a little bit outside of that bubble. So people can find me at popefrancisgeneration.com.
Well, that was easy. PopeFrancisGeneration.com. Paul, thanks. Thanks again. I really, really appreciated being with you today.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. My favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.